everyone, today's lesson is going to cover the second half of 1.4, and again, it's kind of content heavy and vocab heavy. Again, this is just a very big section in your textbook, so let's go ahead and get started. So if we're going to continue the language of anatomy, in the last lesson we focused on directional terms such as superior, inferior, anterior, posterior, proximal, distal, and we also looked at regional terms to help us identify parts of the external structure. In this lesson, we're going to focus more on the internal structure. So body planes and sections we're going to talk about first. When preparing to look at the internal structures of a body, medical students have to make a section or a cut. They make these cuts along imaginary lines, and we call these lines planes. And there are three types of cuts or planes you can make, and they all exist as right angles to one another. The first one that we're going to look at is called a sagittal section or plane. This divides the body or an organ, if you're cutting into an organ, into left and right parts. If you cut it directly right down the middle, this is considered a mid-sagittal cut. And again, this is equal left and right parts. Any other right and left half cuts are called parasagittal. So for example, you may not cut right down the middle, you might cut 3/4. Here, the second type of cut is a frontal, also known as a coronal section. This divides the body or organ that you're looking into anterior or posterior parts. So over here in this picture, we have an example of a frontal, and you'll see that anterior means we get front parts and back halves. The third type is a transverse, or also known as a cross cut. This is when we divide the body or organ into superior or inferior parts, also known as top and bottom halves. So if you look over here at this picture, a transverse cut crosses it, and we have top and bottom halves. Now, why would you want to be able to make different sections? Pause this video, see what you guys can come up with, and then you guys can unpause it. Okay. Hopefully you guys thought along the line, we want to make different sections or cuts to be able to see different angles or parts of the organ. Sometimes an organ cut in a transverse cut will give you a different view than if you cut it as a sagittal cut. Now let's talk about body cavities. There are two internal body cavities, and we have dorsal and ventral. Body cavities provide different degrees of protection to organs within them because typically they're going to be surrounded and covered by bone or muscles. Here's a picture that's located in your textbook to kind of show you the two different varying types. Again, dorsal and ventral. Our dorsal cavity, which we'll talk about first, includes your cranial cavity, which houses your brain. And then the second one is your spinal cavity, which houses your spinal cord. Dorsal, I always think of the dorsal fin of a fish. That's on the backside of a fish, and this is the backside of your body. Ventral is going to be split into your thoracic cavity, and then your abdominal pelvic cavity. And then the abdominal pelvic cavity can further be split into the abdominal cavity and then your pelvic cavity. So here we're going to go through these. I did mention them when we talked through them, but here they are in word format. Dorsal body cavity has two subdivisions, cranial cavity, and this continuously runs into your spinal cavity. We talked about your cranial cavity holding your brain. It's protected by your skull. Spinal cavity houses the spinal cord, and it's protected by the vertebrae in your vertebral column. The ventral body cavity can be divided into two subdivisions, and these two subdivisions are separated by the diaphragm. So if we want to look back at this picture, here is the diaphragm. It's located right under your lungs. Those two cavities are your thoracic cavity, which is basically your chest, and then your abdominal pelvic cavity. Let's look at these a little bit more closely. First, let's look at your thoracic cavity. This cavity is superior to your diaphragm, and all that means is this cavity is above your diaphragm. This is where your heart is located, your lungs, and a couple other organs. Now, there is a part of this cavity called the mediastinum, and this is going to pop back up when we go over the heart and the lungs. This is the central region. It's located right in the middle. Your heart's there, your trachea. Your trachea is basically your windpipe that goes to your lungs, and then a couple other organs. This area separates right and left parts of that cavity, and it's all protected by the rib cage. Your abdominal pelvic cavity, this one is inferior to the diaphragm, or other words known as below. The superior abdominal cavity, which is the top part of this cavity, contains your stomach, your liver, other organs like your gallbladder and your spleen. This is protected by your trunk muscles, or otherwise known as your abs. Your inferior pelvic cavity, this is the lower part, contains your reproductive organs, your bladder, and your rectum. This is protected not by abdominal organs or abs, this is protected by your bony pelvis somewhat. There are no physical structures that separate your abdominal and your pelvic cavity, which is why we just classify it together as abdominal pelvic. So again, here's your abdominal pelvic. It's a huge area. There's no distinct marker, but we do kind of look at the different organs that are there. Now, if you were dissecting a cadaver, which is basically a dead human who's donated their body to science, and you wanted to separate the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity, which type of section would you have to make? So pause the video and see what you guys come up with. If you guys said that you had to make a transverse cut, you would be correct. If we go back to this past paper, the diaphragm separates it into top and bottom, and that's exactly what a transverse cut does, separates the top half from the bottom half. Now, since the abdominal pelvic cavity is quite large with a lot of different organs in them, sometimes it helps to divide these into smaller areas for study. And so they can be divided into 4 quadrants or 9 regions. Here are your 4 abdominal pelvic quadrants. These are quite simple. What confuses most people is the right and left part. Note that here it says right upper quadrant, but it's on the left side of the paper. And that's because when we look at images in A&P, they're always going to be mirrored images. So if it's on the right-hand side, that's usually labeled the left upper quadrant. Here, this is on the right-hand side of the paper, but on a human, that's the left lower quadrant. Here, opposite, right lower quadrant. Here are your 9 abdominal pelvic regions. This one, in terms of knowing the location, is best. The easiest one I always remember is your umbilical region, and that's because it's near your belly button or your umbilical cord. That's where it's attached. From there, we have different regions. We have the epigastric region and the hypogastric, also known as the pubic region, where your pubic bone is going to be located. On the either side of the umbilical region, we have the left lumbar region and the right lumbar region, because that's going to be towards your lower back. Remember, lumbar is your lower back. On either side of the hypogastric region, we have the left iliac region or the right iliac region. Remember, iliac is going to be near your pelvic bone. And then up here in the epigastric region, we have the left hypochondriac and then the right hypochondriac. And then this picture over here kind of shows some different organs that are in each of those regions. For example, if we're looking at the right hypochondriac region, this contains a lot of our liver. Whereas if we're looking at the epigastric region, this contains a lot of our stomach. Here I just have written out what each of these regions are kind of located. The umbilical is our centermost. It's surrounded by the umbilicus, which is the navel or belly button. The epigastric, this is superior to the umbilical region. It contains most of the stomach. The hypogastric, which is pubic, this is inferior to the umbilical region. Hypo usually means below. The right and left iliac, this is lateral to your hypogastric region. It's named after the iliac, which is the top part of your hip bone. We have our right and left lumbar. This is lateral to your umbilical region. This is usually between the bottom of the ribs and the hip bone, or also known as your lower back. And then the right and left hypochondriac. This is lateral to the epigastric, and it contains a lot of the lower ribs. Chondro actually means cartilage. Now, there are a few other body cavities that our body has that weren't necessarily talked about yet. These other things are our oral cavity, which is our mouth. It contains our teeth and tongue. We have our digestive cavities. Our nasal cavity, which is our nose. Our orbital cavities houses our eyes. And then even our middle ear cavities, these hold our eardrums, and we can find tiny bones that transmit sound in them, and that's actually where our smallest bone is located, is in our ear. So which of the following organs are found in the abdominal pelvic cavity? So I want you to pause this video and see what you guys come up with. First off, abdominal pelvic, remember, that is a subdivision of the ventral cavity. And this is going to be below your diaphragm. So this is everything below your diaphragm. So if we start at the beginning, spinal cord. Spinal cord is not part of your ventral cavity. That's part of your dorsal cavity, so that would not be there. The small intestine, yes, that one would be located below your diaphragm. And if you're confused, you guys can all just go back to the picture in your notes and see that here's my small intestine. Yes, it's part of my abdominal pelvic. The uterus, yes, this is actually more in my pelvis region. This is reproductive, all going to be in the abdominal pelvic. And then heart, nope. Your heart is actually more in your thoracic or your chest region along with your lungs. So the only two are small and then the uterus. How'd you guys do? Okay. And that's the end of today's lesson. If you have any questions, please make sure that you ask. And otherwise I hope you guys have a great day.